Here are the key points of this presentation. First, few people donate to congressmen for their campaigns. As a direct result, our economic system has become rigged to favor those who do donate. The system is rigged for the donors. What's been the result? We have crippled our Congress and divided our nation. This is not just bad for our nation. Given our nation's role in the world, it ultimately risks all of humanity to the effects of dictatorship and climate change. But really, donors are not donating that much money. If we look at the amount of money that was donated in the last midterms, it was roughly $9 to $10 billion. That is 1/10 of 1% of the nation's GNP. Given that it was spent over 2 years, it was closer to 1/20th. It's about the same or half the amount of money that people in the United States spent on Netflix. Now, what is the significance of this 1/10 or 1/20th of 1%? If you use a fiduciary financial advisor to manage your financial assets, they'll charge between 0.5% and 1.2%. That's the kind of management fee you'd expect to pay somebody to manage your assets. But the donors are not fiduciaries. While donors have various motives, probably mostly good and some bad, they're not necessarily out there to benefit the rest of the population of the United States. In fact, we can show policies adopted under their narrow perspectives have been quite damaging to the bulk of our population and the nation as a whole. What do we do about this? We can set up a system of campaign finance vouchers. We'll have to define what we mean by that. Such a system would make donors of everyone, that is, all voters. Not only would it end up costing donors a lot less money than our current campaign finance system, it would ultimately avoid massive financial and economic damage to the nation. We would see many results. The voters would return to being the primary influence on Congress rather than just donors. Government would start working again. Government would make fewer stupid decisions. This would be better for everyone, even for the donors. How do we get there? We will need inspiring leadership. We need to inspire the public to donate enough to wake up our members of Congress and to demand they pass the legislation needed for campaign finance vouchers. This is the basic outline of this presentation. It is in 3 sections. First, I'm going to talk about what a mess we've created, talk about signs of the mess, and demonstrate how those signs align with the donation patterns we've seen. Next, I'll try to explain how our current methods of financing election campaigns has led us into this mess. It's a complex, multi-part problem that needs a bit of historical context and more time than I would wish to use. Why is it, after almost 200 years, that campaign finance has such power now? Why, like Britain in the run-up to Brexit, are we seem to be on the verge of flying apart geographically in an eruption of cultural resentment and near hatred? The third section is devoted to laying out the steps needed to bring about healing change, including steps to inspire unity and generate support for proposed legislation. In order to keep this presentation to a reasonable length, I've relegated some details to additional presentations. Here I'm listing the main takeaways for each of these 3 sections. First, the mess section. The big takeaway: Americans are very unhappy with their government. We have an immune system against such unhappiness. It's called control by voters. It's the basis of democracy and representative democracy. We have significantly weakened that immune system. There are many symptoms of an ongoing infection. The biggest one: to much of the population, the system feels rigged. Trump picked right up on that symptom. His election and continued popularity reflects the reality of that rigging. A consummate tactician, he was sufficiently alert and bold enough to take advantage of the situation. If the mess is a symptom of an active infection, what is the disease? I call it campaign finance disease. It's a new disease, like COVID. It needs a new cure. In the second section, the Explain section, I go into the history, the logic, and especially the misunderstandings that dominate discussion. Those misunderstandings keep us from really coming to grips with this disease. Finally, in the third section, the Do section, I want to discuss the only viable, achievable solution: campaign finance vouchers. Vouchers are a tested cure that needs to be developed further and deployed as soon as possible. I briefly discuss a somewhat non-traditional approach to vouchers, leaving most details to a separate discussion. I discuss the many tantalizing non-solutions based on misunderstandings that divert us away from focusing on the voucher cure for this disease. But most important are the immediate steps we need to take to get there, and in particular, the need for leadership. Leadership that will get our discouraged public to act, and by acting, motivate legislators after 2024 to enact the legislation to set vouchers in place and cure this disease. Okay, now we'll start talking about this mess our country has. It is clear that the public knows we have a problem. The Gallup survey operation has a monthly survey where they just ask people to name their most important problem for the country. It's a free-form question where they can say what they like. The survey takers group the responses. Concern about government has really risen to the top. As the Tea Party blew up in reaction to the Great Recession, passage of our anemic health plan, and equally anemic recession recovery, from 2011 to 2012, concern about government grew from the fourth item to the third. Ever since then, it's always been first or second. It was top 7 times. Twice it was second to the economy. In 2020, it was second to COVID. But after COVID, it jumped back to being number 1 again. I'm not quite sure what it is in 2023, but I'm confident it's headed that way. The public knows they have a problem with our government. The question is, do they know where the problem comes from? I don't think they do. What are the biggest signs that we have a crisis with our government? I think the 4 I'll show on this slide are the biggest signs. First, we have a severely divided population. Both bravery and fear must be taught. As parents, we teach our babies, our toddlers, to both try new foods and to watch out and look both ways. We pay taxes to educate our children to understand the world's dangers and joys. The human species did well because they were willing to entertain their curiosity and approach the novel, but also because they were suitably cautious about the other, especially other groups or tribes. Our caution about the other is politically significant. Recent studies have shown that a person's attitude about the importance of differences in such things as race, national origin, religion, and sexual orientation is a good predictor of that person's political orientation. People who regard these differences as very important tend to be what we typically call conservative. They tend to have a natural home in the traditional Republican Party. Likewise, people who aren't so bothered by such differences tend to be a bit more liberal. They tend to have a natural home in the Democratic Party, using the terms liberal and conservative in their classic sense. This difference in attitude towards others has shown up in our political history many times. Consider immigration. The U.S. is described as a mixing bowl of people from all over the world. For much of our history, this mixing bowl has been a source of pride. Usually, the vast economic benefits from immigration and freedom of movement help smooth over our natural discomfort with the other. We've seen the explosion of economic progress in the European Union when they opened up their mutual borders to free movement of people, and the destruction of that progress in England by Brexit. Right now, we have inflation and critical jobs going begging while thousands are left waiting at our borders. Nevertheless, support for immigration sometimes fell off. Riots in the Civil War against Irish immigrants, restrictions on Chinese immigration, and the push to lessen immigration after the First World War. In almost all cases, fear of economic effects on wages and availability of jobs amplified the basic human tendency to fear the other. Other cultural differences show up in our politics. In the 2000s, disparate groups of Christians with conservative views, typically aligned with the Republican Party on political issues, especially abortion and gender, banded together to refer to themselves as evangelical Christians. In 2016, they committed themselves to a president whose personal behavior they found offensive in the hope that he would bring their views to dominate in the Supreme Court. Racial bias has motivated past voting restrictions and lies behind the many current attempts to restrict voting. Our drug laws essentially reflect racial and cultural bias by banning use of some substances, such as heroin and marijuana, while allowing legal paths for use of equally dangerous ones, including alcohol and tobacco. Restrictions on treatment for gender-affirming care reflect cultural discomfort. Discomfort about any cultural difference can be amplified by economic stress. What economic stress applies now? In absolute terms, the average income of the U.S. has greatly improved over the last 30 years. Productivity has soared and prices of goods have fallen. However, that increase in average income and wealth hides huge disparities in those economic benefits. This has built resentment. That resentment has, as usual, served to amplify discomfort about these many cultural differences. As I will show later, both the income disparities and the emphasis on fear are outcomes of our bad political campaign finance system. Location is important. Given our constitutional provision of 2 senators per state, regardless of population size, an especially ominous aspect is that the division is by location. Division shows up as rural versus urban versus suburban. The economic changes of the last 30 years have significantly increased disparity by location. The quality of education, the jobs available, what kind of skills those jobs require, all vary by location. It's not just income. Life is different. People are different. Who you meet, who you talk to, all are different by location. So it's not just economics. Significant cultural change tends to originate in the suburbs, cities, and among the educated and young. This aggravates division by location. What we have now is this huge sense of us versus them. In particular, we now have 3 political parties. We have the Democrats trying fitfully to get back to their roots, and the traditional Republicans who don't quite know who they are, and then there's the MAGA followers attempting with notable success to seize the name Republican from those who they see, quite accurately, as having betrayed them. While many MAGA are refugees from the Democrats, seeing themselves as having been economically harmed, as they were, most are probably quite sensitive to cultural differences, hence natural Republicans. Many are enamored by Trump's empty boasts and see little to comfort themselves from traditional Republicans. And, of course, we've got independents and people who don't vote because it doesn't seem like the politicians are listening, so why bother? They are right about no one listening, but I need to explain why. These multiple subpopulations do not feel unified. It takes a certain amount of unity to feel like you're in one country, to see your fellow countrymen as, in a sense, brothers. Instead, we see mutual disdain and something verging on hate. This division is talked about all the time. It's obvious to everyone. The posters put up in their yards really say something. The other three signs on this slide all flow from this division, though the connection is a bit indirect. Consider our Congress. It has become impotent. It cannot produce. We think an elected member is there to work on laws and deal with issues, that they have the power to vote on policies and budgets that will work for their district. Not so. For all but a few members, a tiny few, it is nothing like that. Only the leaders have power. The rest are walking slaves who must vote the party line on any issue of substance. They cannot compromise and have little or no power to influence legislation. An impotent Congress weakens the presidency. Without a working Congress, one that can compromise, the president has little power to lead. Sometimes there will be little spurts of legislative activity, such as the Affordable Care Act. It barely squeaked through and was a very weak approach to general health care. In the absence of Republican support, it was tailored instead to get support from the large health insurance companies. It got weakened much further by the Supreme Court and Republican resistance in half the states. The need to spend money has allowed a few changes, like tax changes to reward the rich, and the recent Inflation Reduction Act, to slip in on 51-50 votes. All kinds of other issues like guns and abortions simply linger. Our weakened presidents, without a functioning Congress, have resorted to using their only remaining tool, executive actions. But executive actions are not democratic. They are not laws. They lack the formal stamp of approval. They simply are things the current president can temporarily do. The courts, especially the Supreme Court, have been significantly weakened. The Supreme Court is now heavily populated with people who are appointed without large Senate endorsements. Voted onto the bench by margins of 1 or 2 votes, they are viewed by the public as completely partisan, as representative of their party. Other judges, when faced with politically sensitive cases, are routinely painted by the public with the same brush. Judge X was nominated by President Y. Yes, we have a political system teetering on the edge of collapse. In all of this, we see the effects of cultural division and our bad campaign finance system. There are many less obvious signs of the distress in our country. All were briefly mentioned in the previous slide. First, the system is rigged economically. This was Trump's claim, and while he seemed unable to be truthful about much else, to much of the public, the truth of this really struck home. In our system today, the economic policies, especially tax policies, of our government favor the successful, the rich, and the special interests. They're basically against almost everyone else. Resentment about this was one of the big things that led to support for Trump. With Trump, they found a king, and fed on 2 decades of cultural attacks by the Republicans, he helped them find lots of groups to blame. With regard to pre-war Germany, it was the Jews, but now it's whoever doesn't support Trump. Finally, as I mentioned before, the U.S. system is based on 2 parties. With 3, we basically can't govern. We do not have a parliamentary system that is somewhat comfortable with coalition governing. Besides the smaller national issues like guns, abortion, access to health care, and immigration, we cannot deal with catastrophic threats like climate change, a degrading environment, and the next disease. In the next slide, we'll touch on some details about specific aspects of our economically rigged system. So, I claim the system is rigged. You could ask, in what sense is it rigged? Let's highlight some examples. I've got a much longer list, but these are good enough to get a taste. Item 1. There was little political response as economic change crushed the heartland of our country. The primary change was huge improvements in the productivity of our agricultural and industrial base. The demand for low-skilled workers plummeted, while the demand for high-skilled workers, what I call the successful, doubled. The blow fell especially hard in the rural areas, small cities, and among minorities that used to be the base of the Democratic Party. Why was there no response to keep our people whole? Look under the covers. You'll see that these workers may be large in numbers, but are quite small in the two parties' true focus, campaign finance donations. With that focus, this steadily growing human distress was ignored by both parties from the late 1990s through the early 2000s, ignored until Trump woke us up. Unfortunately, handily gathering millions of votes to win the Republican nomination wasn't enough to wake us. He had to actually win the 2016 election to prop open our eyes. While our intentions have improved, without a working Congress, little has been accomplished. Unfortunately, Trump's win did not directly point to the true problem, our campaign finance system. Item 2. Enamored by free-flowing campaign donations from Wall Street, in the 1990s, both parties put on blindfolds and told regulators to keep looking the other way, as crooks were allowed to bring on the worst recession since the Great Depression. Still protected by their pattern of campaign donations, there was no jail time for those crooks. Most of them are still out there finding new ways to cheat us. They and their compliant regulators find it better to use stockholder money to pay fines instead of going to jail. In the last 18 months, continuing the established pattern of let's not look too closely at what the big banks are doing, those big banks lost a third to half their market value, all while continuing to tell the regulators that, unlike 3 of the largest bank failures in history, their trillions of investments in risky derivatives were completely unaffected by the fastest interest rate increase in U.S. history. Do you remember that term derivatives from 2008? Meanwhile, the regulators and our elected officials are presumably getting ready to explain away the need to operate a new bailout of these too-big-to-fail banks, the same banks that they just allowed to get much bigger by absorbing the recently failed ones. Given building resentment at unemployment damage in our heartland, this Great Recession, with its added economic damage, the huge bailouts, and failure to prosecute, all combined to bring on popular outrage. Much of that outrage had a name, the Tea Party. In 2015, it got a synonym, Make America Great Again. With a crippled government and utter disunity, can we survive another banking crisis? Item 3. Prior to 1990, our federal tax system was progressive. Progressive to implement the classic concept, from those who have much, much more is expected. In the past 3 decades, to please campaign donors, we've twisted that tax system. We twisted it into a system to enrich the rich and favor the successful. For the successful, those with good, well-paying jobs that put them in the upper half of the income spectrum, these expensive tax cuts and tax credits all seem perfectly innocent, all while leaving decorative crumbs and huge budget deficits for the rest. Item 4. Reflecting the cumulative effect of these tax changes, we have seen growing inequality of income and wealth. We are no longer the envy of the world for the opportunities you offer our children to grow out of poverty. Item 5. Government programs such as TANF, food stamps, school lunches, and Medicaid all help, but focused only on costs and rarely looking at the benefits, we've not addressed the real bottom line. Why do we have so many families stressed over their ability to feed their children? Under the influence of campaign finance and cultural complaints that are so popular with conservative donors, we abandoned cash welfare for poor families. In his 1996 State of the Union, President Clinton said, quote, "The era of big government is over, but we cannot go back to the time when our citizens were left to fend for themselves," unquote. But as far as cash welfare is concerned, we did leave our citizens to fend for themselves. Ignoring protests from his own party, we replaced aid for families with dependent children with TANF, a system that is just as expensive but serves far fewer poor people and pays each much less money. Then we cut childhood poverty in half by making the child tax credit refundable. Then watched poverty jump right back up when we stopped. Why does the U.S. still have, by far, the highest child poverty rate in the developed world? Why do we so undervalue the benefits to us all from a cohort of healthy kids? Well, poorer parents do vote, but they do not donate to election campaigns. Item 6. Campaign finance at work. We've gutted retirement for middle and lower income people. An underlying source of the feeling that the system is rigged is the question faced by most. Will I be able to retire? For most of our population, the answer is no. A weak system based on pensions that work reasonably well for many has been replaced by an extremely expensive system of 401ks and Roth retirement plans. These programs were touted as programs to quote-unquote encourage saving, so middle and lower middle income employees would have enough money saved to retire with decent incomes. While this system can work well for those with incomes in the highest 20%, if they participate and if their companies are large and sophisticated, it was, by design, open for abuse by the rich. The 100 richest CEOs in our country have accumulated more tax-sheltered retirement money than the total accumulation of the bottom 41% of the participants. 401k and Roth simply allow the rich to protect from taxation the money they would save anyway. But for employees of modest means, 401k retirement has massive flaws. Its voluntary nature means most people do not participate. Worse, being subject to voluntary withdrawals or rollovers to new employers forces funds at small to medium-sized companies to invest in short-term bonds that cannot grow fast enough to support adequate income in retirement. There are options that would be much better for those with modest income and not subject to massive tax avoidance by the well-off, but people with modest income are not campaign finance donors. Finally, and of course most significant, item 7, we have left our children holding the bag for the climate disaster. Huge parts of the country, especially in coastal areas, are already having difficulty buying home insurance. The fossil fuel companies use campaign donations as a nose ring to lead around our Congress. There's a lot more detail available, but hopefully this is enough to get the idea. Indeed, the system is rigged. Let me take a moment for some context about what is at stake here. About 100 BC, the Roman Republic was on the verge of collapse. It was falling into civil war, dictatorship, and the Roman Empire. Cato and Cicero were two Roman aristocrats. They wrote and spoke extensively about the threats they saw to the Roman Republic. They made valiant efforts to prevent dictatorship. After a gap of 1900 years, including the discovery of the New World, the founders of our country got together to write a constitution. They and the educated people of the 18th century Age of Reason were great admirers of the words of Cato and Cicero. Our Constitution reflects that admiration. Are we about to lose another republic? We've got competing donors struggling for control, spending ever-growing amounts of money, but the result is a country awash in division and a government unable to act in the face of tremendous threats. Not only more COVIDs in a world filled with dictators, but we are essentially asleep as the world heats up. Will we continue to be this frog in a slowly heating pot, wondering if we should jump out? Will we wake up in time? Are we going to remain stupid? That new world, with its massive resources to exploit, was crucial to breaking the usual pattern of kings and dictators. There will not be another new world to discover. How did campaign finance come to have its dominant position in our country's government? Here are some key ideas I'll look at. Campaign finance money has always been important, but prior to the 1990s, it didn't seem to dominate government policy. Corruption has always been a part of government and campaign finance. We've written many laws in response to such problems. For instance, Andrew Jackson giving government jobs to donors. Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall in New York turned this into an art form. Bribery and corruption, such as the Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s, are all familiar events. Nevertheless, by and large, voters ruled. Voter opinion affected what laws got passed, what policies were adopted. For instance, there was a scandal in the late 1980s and early 90s with the savings and loan business. We ended up jailing the crooks who were behind this scandal. Compare that to the tender treatment of the thieves responsible for the Great Recession. A major rock hit the pond in the 70s and 80s when we switched from using conventions to using primaries to nominate candidates for the House and Senate. Primaries are inherently more expensive to run than conventions. Initially, this change didn't cause big changes to the way we run our government. For instance, Ronald Reagan held only 2 fundraisers to raise money for his re-election campaign. Barack Obama, in the 2000s, had to attend 200. That indicates the scale of the eventual impact. It began to be noticeable in the 1990s. These expensive primaries led to the need for more donations. That led to donor-friendly policies, and that led to the mess that we described above. But how exactly has this led to the broken government we see today? To see the connection, we need to focus on a specific characteristic of the rigged system and its cultural divisions. Namely, the damage differs by location. It differs by congressional district. This has led to a dramatic decrease in competitive seats and an increase in safe seats. That is, all but a tiny few of the seats in the House are locked into a single party. Winning the primary virtually guarantees a win in the general election for that seat. This shift towards safe seats reflects the rise of hate and division in our country. This shift has created a situation where most congressmen are essentially slaves to their party. They are forced to spend most of their time dialing for dollars. They're locked in cubicles calling wealthy people to ask for campaign donations. They can spend very little time on public business and have virtually no freedom to vote for the unique interests of their own district. This, in turn, has made compromise among the parties impossible. Without compromise, effective government is essentially impossible. This is what has shut down our government and turned it into such a mess. Surveys indicate that the public is suspicious about campaign finance money. They think campaign money might be involved somehow in explaining their unhappiness with our government. But they tend to see it as corruption in the old sense, as personal greed for money. But it can't be my congressman. Americans tend to like their current congressman. In a competitive seat, maybe not. They might have voted for the other guy. But in safe seats, the population may not approve of everything he says, but can't imagine him being corrupt. No, it's the other guys. It's those Democrats in those other districts, or it's the Republicans, or it's that guy who votes with Trump. If it's not Congress, maybe it's just the rich. The rich are so rich they just bought everybody out. As I will explain, it's not that simple. The real story hasn't been told. But to make the real story comprehensible, we need to acknowledge the context. How will someone who does not donate now react if asked, "Have you donated?" Their likely reaction is, "What? They may have never been asked to donate. Their parents didn't donate. No one ever taught them in school about donating to election campaigns. Where was that when I was in school? I don't remember anybody talking about that. What's going on here? Why should I even think about donating to my congressman? No one talked about that before. I thought I was doing my duty by voting. Everyone just talks about doing that. I don't have the income. Money's tight already. What good would my few dollars do? The rich are spending their billions. That kind of thinking represents misunderstanding of the problem. There's a tall teaching hill to be climbed here. As mentioned earlier, some people are conservative. They tend to be sensitive to change and cultural differences. In the U.S., they are natural Republicans. Others are less sensitive to these things and are natural Democrats. We see this conservative liberal pattern everywhere in the world. Identical twins tend to vote the same, while fraternal twins are much less likely to vote the same. Because of this, scientists think there may be genetic reasons for this pattern. Most people are closer to the middle of the conservative-liberal spectrum. They will lean one way or the other, but can be readily influenced by other factors. Campaign finance has distorted the policy implications of this effect. Holding relatively extreme views will encourage a person to act. In this case, donate money for elections. When parties shifted their messaging to the extreme, they increased donations. The Republican Party found fear of cultural change a powerful tool, a control knob, a knob they could use to meet the new challenge of raising the additional money needed to fund primaries. The Democratic Party didn't have a corresponding fear knob they could use to turn up donations, so under Clinton and Obama, they softened their policy positions towards the right. Policy actions followed the money. The Democratic Party found its fear knob when Trump woke them up. Unfortunately, that has had the net effect of simply driving both parties further away from the middle. In the old story, some people in the ancient town of Hamelin did not like their rats. They paid a piper to lead the rats away. The story doesn't address the wishes of those who think rats are kind of cute and part of nature's environmental balance, and maybe we should think about alternative approaches. So, whose interests are paying our political leaders, our pipers, and whose interests are being ignored? Where does the money come from to influence our leaders to take actions? 21% of the population contribute money to pay the cost of campaign finance. Of that, the rich, as usual, will contribute. And the rich will get listened to very carefully, even more carefully now, because when you're desperate for money, money has a much louder voice. As I will show, in the last 3 decades, politicians have become quite desperate for money. Contribution behavior by special interests, especially business interests, will follow the same pattern. From both parties, because business wants favors wherever they can be found. Single-issue voters, often very small dollar donors, have a special path to politician ears because they are, above all, very reliable donors. Interest in guns, abortion, environment, and more recently climate yields steady flows of money. The successful, people with good jobs and incomes in the range of $150,000 to $300,000 may donate. Not wealthy exactly, but comfortable. Many donate. Most do not, but enough of them. Enough to have their interests show up in legislation, such as contentment with a 401k as a fine retirement system for them, as the rest of the population drifts towards retirement poverty. What about the rest of us, those not in the above 4 groups? Some of them donate also. A few members, perhaps. Others Just nice people paying attention, I guess. That leaves 71% of the population, what I'm calling the rest of us. They either only vote or they don't even vote at all. So the question is, does this throw some light on the public's complaints about bad government? Not just who's paying the piper, but who's not. Who's not paying the piper? I suspect most of the 71% have never considered donating. Maybe some think that by not donating, they're getting away with something, getting something for free. It might be time to show them what this free thing is actually costing them. Our campaign finance disaster got a slow start. In the 70s, exploiting resentment over civil rights legislation, the Republicans replaced the Democrats in the South, but the government kept on working. In the 80s, primaries replaced conventions and nominations got expensive, but the government kept on working. In the 90s, the new effects slowly built up. The rich and the special interests found a new use for their money, funding Republican primary election campaigns. Before primaries, their money wasn't so useful. General elections cost some money for advertising and getting out the vote. But when an election is between two parties where the issues seem relatively clear, piling on more TV radio ads and stuffing more mailboxes reaches the point of irritating more than influencing. With a primary, there's no such built-in clarity. There can be lots of candidates and little prior name recognition. More money can talk and swing primary votes, and in the process, soften up the opposition for the coming general election. With no base of voters used to the idea of donating for elections, those with money slowly found targets. The so-called Gingrich Revolution was the first place we saw this. Newt Gingrich inspired the Republicans and their donors when he found that harsh words and cultural attacks were useful tools to raise campaign finance money. Imaginary welfare queens were the equivalent of imaginary communists in the State Department at generating a change. The Democrats and Clinton found themselves needing primary money too, and suddenly it became useful to try and change the message. Ah, there's a problem with welfare. Wow, that makes some sense to moderate Democrats who have lots of money and no day-to-day knowledge of the struggles of the poor. That financially useful tact fully bloomed by the time of Clinton's 1996 re-election. Quote, "The era of big government is over," unquote. We can leave the poor behind, but claim not to do so by touting this benevolent plan to encourage work and training, all based on the implicit assumption that the poor are too ignorant or stupid to want to work and learn. The truth? The poor could vote, but were in no position to donate campaign finance funds. The 1990s saw tremendous economic growth and no major foreign wars. Patting ourselves on the back for the collapse of the Soviet Union, we spent nothing to prevent Russia's return to its historic pattern of control by the robber barons and a king named Putin. This was the era of computers. Personal computers came into heavy use in office work in the 1990s, reducing the need for less skilled office staff and increasing the demand for the more skilled. We started to see tremendous changes in our factories as automation allowed productivity to soar and demand for manual labor to drop. The era of factory farms finally bloomed. Our global trade really expanded with the opening up of China, joined to a hope that quote-unquote market forces would magically transform a dictatorship into something better. And this was the era of our last, late-lamented, balanced budget. All this while the huge inflows of campaign finance money first persuaded our elected politicians to look the other way as financial regulators stopped enforcing Glass-Steagall. That legal firewall was supposed to keep the banks from using our deposits to speculate in stocks and other risky financial adventures. And then, in 1998, we repealed that now ignored safety barrier to unbridled greed, with consequences to follow. Let me illustrate the change in U.S. employment patterns. The demand for low-skilled workers dropped while the demand for high-skilled workers rose dramatically. The first three sectors illustrate the drop. And agriculture went from employing 6% of our workers down to 1%. Most of our farmers are highly skilled specialists using expensive capital equipment. Manual labor jobs, a mix of high and low skills ranging from tradesmen to the lady holding the construction stop sign, were cut almost in half. Even low-skilled service jobs such as retail saw a 20% drop. Together, this was a big drop in the employment opportunities for people with low skills. Over that same 40 years, the demand for high-skilled service more than doubled. Services such as legal, education, and health all require college or graduate training. Office work, which is a mix of high and low skill, also increased sharply from a third of jobs to almost half. The next slide suggests how these changes in employment demand affected employee income. Let me just briefly show an indicator of the change to incomes as labor demand shifted over the last 40 years. In 1980, a person who had graduated from college was earning, on average, 45% more than a person who only graduated from high school. By 2020, that advantage almost doubled to 82%. In other words, the payoff to college has steadily increased. Not a surprise, but relevant to our discussion. What would be a logical response to this change in demand for skills? This was a national change. While it differed in intensity by state, it affected not just them, it affected the whole population. The logical response to a widespread problem would be a national response. But that's not the response that we got. What we got was each state is on its own, none for all and all for none. We didn't have a national response. First, there was no national effort to invest in new industry. It has been left to each state. States responded by individually seeking new industry. This creates an incentive to race to the bottom, where, eager to tout jobs, politicians sacrifice long-term community health and its taxing potential. Without a national approach, states whose employment base was heavily damaged have no direct path to get federal support. The resources of the majority of the people, communities, and industries who thrived are not easily tapped. In recent years, this omission was made worse by incentivizing companies to distribute profits as stock buybacks. As tax-favored capital gains, this not only minimized income tax paid by the wealthy and successful, but also minimized the company's investment in new productive capacity and jobs. Second, there was no national response for increasing the skills of our workforce with education and training. Proposals to make two-year college free, like high school, have gone nowhere. Some attention has recently been given to greatly expanding support for apprenticeship, but it hasn't been passed. As noted, the real value of cash welfare, specifically pitched to allow families in poverty to continue their education, decreased. We decreased the real size of college Pell Grants. Hammered by the Great Recession, most states were forced to slow their support for college. The real cost of attendance, that is, tuition, room and board, plus living expenses, at public colleges has continued to steadily grow. Third, impacted communities were even worse off because we gutted welfare and made the expansion of Medicaid optional. With Medicaid, many states were governed by conservatives who claimed incorrectly that it would result in higher taxes. Studies clearly show that expanding Medicaid actually improves state budgets by increasing the health of its population and their ability to work. Finally, we don't have a national health plan. Availability of health care, especially to hospitals and specialists, has steadily gotten worse in small cities and rural areas. The crushing of our industrial base aggravated this long-term trend. In summary, Our response has been basically state by state. A national response could have integrated all these elements: industry, education, compensation, and health, all while inviting the states to participate and coordinate their efforts. But we didn't try. Very few who lost their jobs were campaign finance donors. Let me explain the rural-urban political divide and the connection to safe seats. In the urban-suburban world, we see a much denser concentration of people with higher skills. As a result, the urban-suburban world has the good jobs, good income, and good health care. Their residents tend to get more benefit from the 3-decade drift into tax policies that favor the rich. The tax rate reductions, the tax credits, the deductions for tax-favored retirement plans all tend to favor people with higher incomes and those who tend to live in the urban-suburban areas. In the rural areas, things are different. In many places, the good jobs in manufacturing that made the lower cost of housing a significant benefit were gone. Owning a now nearly valueless home near extended family became a thorny problem. Health care is inherently more difficult and costly to deliver in small communities. Without a national health plan, health care in rural areas has simply gotten worse over the decades. Because primary and secondary education is usually financed through local taxes, sometimes with state equalization systems, rural areas often have less money per child for education. That is made even worse as local industry shrank. Also, parental income and wealth, that is, socioeconomic status, and the wealth of the neighborhood offers significant advantages to the eventual income and wealth of children. As mentioned earlier, the opportunity to move out of poverty is significantly lower in the U.S. than it used to be. This adds to the us versus them emotional divide. With less income, people in these rural areas see very little benefit from the tax changes that were structured to give most of the benefits to the wealthy and high income. And as mentioned before, as their world was hammered by productivity changes, their communities were especially harmed as welfare was changed. Given this difference, the rural population feels economically left behind. They were, in fact, left behind. It is easy to blame relatively less damaged city folks for this. That is true even if their own consistently conservative House members, dependent on re-election donations from the rich and wealthy, voted for the very tax changes that left them behind. As mentioned before, cultural issues also work to divide rural folk emotionally from their fellow countrymen in the cities. There is something approaching hatred between those who live in the rural areas and those who live in cities and suburbs. This is the rural reds and the urban blues. As a result, from 1998 to 2022, the number of competitive House seats dropped from about 80 in 1998 down to about 30. This change was gradual, with a loss of 5 to 10 seats with every 2-year election. Other than the 30, the rest of the seats are safe. In these seats, the primary is the real election. The general election is usually a foregone conclusion. If you win the primary, you've won the general election. Donor control revealed its ugly side in the 2000s. In 2001, after 9/11, we resumed spending massive amounts on foreign wars, including one we started on our own in 2003. By 2006 and 2007, the Wall Street financial time bomb that we set in place in the late 1990s began ticking and then exploded. With campaigns dependent on donations, we passed laws, such as Dodd-Frank, that address the symptoms, the crooked behavior, but not the underlying source of the problem, our campaign finance system. We asked the crooks to, pretty please, don't do that anymore. Then, looking over the Monopoly board with all its monopoly money, we told them, you don't need to go to jail. Just send in some fines and, when passing go, collect hundreds of billions in bailouts. Note that these fines were taken from assets of the company shareholders, not the crooks who did the deed. They're still out there pretending to be upstanding citizens and donating like mad to both political parties. The public was angry about the bailouts, angry that no one was prosecuted. Conservatives were offended by attempts to help borrowers fooled into taking on mortgages they couldn't afford. Given this anger, there was little support for strong public spending to reduce unemployment and speed up the recovery. The recovery from 2008 got off to an extremely slow start. With our heartland already hurting from the closure of its factories, the slow start to recovery from the Great Recession simply added fuel to the resentment. From 2010 to 2016, the feelings of resentment grew, giving birth to the Tea Party and eventually Trump. This continued the division of the country by location into safe seats. With it, Congress became disabled. Individual House members in safe seats are effectively under the thumb of House leadership. Most senators are not much safer. Why? Because leadership appears to have the power to influence the flow of donations away from any safe seat member who strays from the party line. That safe seat member would only need those donations if they strayed enough to prompt a primary opponent. That's when some big donors or networks sponsor a primary opponent because the current member has been insufficiently obedient to the party line. This is what's called the being primaried threat. Lee Drutman, in a recent piece in New America, gets into the details about how this is perceived to be a constant problem. Though it has rarely happened, it looms very large in the minds of incumbents. Given its rarity, why does it loom so large? It's because those incumbents have no reason to believe their voters, the ones who originally elected them, would cough up the funds to fight off a seriously funded primary opponent. As I will show a bit later, individual safe seat members have very limited local sources of donations. They have few small donors. If money is needed, it's only going to come from big donors or from outside the member's district. In the last few years, we've seen this seeming disloyalty and outraged response from donors playing out with several examples. For instance, Democratic Senators Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema are under pressure, and the Republican members of Congress who voted to impeach Trump with no donor money to run again have all dropped out. With this, party loyalty becomes a straitjacket. By crossing the aisle, by compromising, the member can reasonably fear losing access to the money needed to seek re-election. They can't compromise because that threatens the party unity that the donors value. This being primary threat has essentially turned the need for party loyalty into slavery. The leader's real job is to ensure that party unity is maintained. So, while most seats are safe for the party, for the member, no seat is safe. That's bad enough. But beyond that, they are told they must spend their time dialing for dollars, sitting in a cubicle for half their time, calling wealthy people who might donate the maximum, or chatting up others who might, directly or indirectly, ensure the flow of dollars to the party or party-aligned dark money organizations. Why must they do this? They are raising money for others. They are told that if they want to have donor support for themselves when fighting any future primary or general election opponent, which is now fiercely expensive, they must do this fundraising. As a result, regular safe seat members have no time to do the job they were supposedly hired to do, with disastrous results for us all. This system was apparently pretty much in place after 2008. It certainly was by 2016. With compromise difficult, moving serious legislation became nearly impossible. The system became rigged originally because the relevant legal structures such as taxes, Wall Street, regulation, retirement, agriculture, and fossil fuel use have been the consistent focus of donors for 3 decades. Most changes that managed to pass in the 2000s, such as taxation changes and the Inflation Reduction Act, were attached to bills that could not be filibustered and were, therefore, completely partisan. Other than hasty responses to crises, such as recession relief, war funding, Dodd-Frank, and COVID, there's almost no possibility of passing legislation on most topics without the coverage of such legislative tricks. There's been no budgeting. Other than crisis money, we use continuing resolutions and a few must-pass reauthorizations. We allowed huge budget deficits to go unaddressed. The public can easily see that their opinions are ignored. Passionate anti-abortion small donors proved to be so reliable and generous, they led the Republicans down an out-of-step path that will be a huge handicap for 2024. Enthusiastic gun-owning donors have put the Republican Party in a similar costly headlock. Republican members offend their own donors by stressing over popular entitlements such as Social Security and Medicare. When wondering out loud where the tax money will come from, they know full well that much of it must come by reducing their donors' favorite tax goodies. Of course, compared to climate change, these policies are far down the list of serious threats to our future. There were attempts in this period to restrict donations and campaign spending. They either failed to pass or, if enacted, were reversed by the courts. As we will see, these legislative approaches represent a misunderstanding by everybody, including the Democrats, of the nature of the thing they're dealing with. They tried to suppress donations instead of expanding them to everyone, so every donor becomes an influencer. We've been talking about campaign finance money. How much money are we talking about? The 2 graphs on this page talk about the history, since 1990, of campaign finance spending for Congress, for both House and Senate together. The numbers on the side of each graph are billions of inflation-adjusted dollars for dates from 1990 to 2024. There are 2 sources of information, one for each graph. First, the Federal Election Commission. The FEC keeps records of how much money has been officially donated. Our election laws put restrictions on how much can be donated this way. The graph of that data is on the left. It has the totals of all the money that's been donated under these restrictive FEC rules. The graph on the right is an estimate from the organization Open Secrets. It shows its estimates of how much money was actually spent. That includes both the FEC numbers and all the supposedly independent and non-coordinated spending that results from all those conversations that the candidates and everyone else has to boost spending outside of the official channels. You can argue about how accurate the Open Secrets numbers are, but they've made a really valiant effort to get the data. They seem confident that they have come very close. Note that Open Secrets technology cannot yet make estimates for the 8 early years from 1990 to 98. My question marks in the right-hand graph indicate guesses. They're based on the pattern of FTC numbers for those years. So let's see what the data says. Looking at the graph on the left, the FEC-only money, official donations grew rapidly in the early 1990s from about $1/3 billion in 1990 to about $500 million in 1992 and 94. That's a 20% rate of increase. No wonder Clinton and the Democrats became alarmed. Maybe that donation money jump is what doomed welfare as we know it. From 94 to 98, FEC donations didn't change much at all. In the following 18 years, 98 to 2016, FEC donations continued growing from about $2/3 billion to $1 billion, but at a leisurely rate of about 3% a year. I guess I would call that moderately fast in that the number of seats didn't change, only the perceived stakes at risk in these elections. Looking at the graph on the right, that adds in the non-FEC spending. We see that over that same 18-year period, 98 to 16, total spending grew at roughly the same rate as FEC donations, around 3.7%. One thing should really jump out at you. While the trend has been upward for quite a while, after 2016, on either graph, there's a sharp increase in donations and spending. In both graphs, it grew at an astounding 25% annual rate, reaching $10 billion in 2020. I'm guessing it'll be around $12 billion in 2024. The sharp increase was in reaction to the win by Trump in 2016. Here's my interpretation. A complacent Democratic Party relying on donations from the rich and successful were calmly increasing their donations until 2016. In 2015 and 16, their donors, not being representative of their traditional donor base, could not imagine what was motivating support for Trump. They sneered. I saw this repeatedly when trying to talk to them. When the Democrats and much of the public suddenly woke up in November 2016, it began to dawn on them that Trump was a desperate threat. His subsequent actions merely increased that sense of threat. Democrats began opening their wallets. Unfortunately, the sneering did not stop. Commentators consistently failed and still fail to ask themselves, why? Why did otherwise seemingly rational voters vote for such a person? Traditional Republican donors, especially the rich and successful, were equally unable to see the pre-existing hurt, the sense that the system is rigged, that Trump fed on. They were surprised and delighted at the gift that suddenly landed in their lap. Still not understanding, but seeing the response from Democratic donors in 2018, they also opened their wallets wider. They didn't realize that the gift, like an Indian blanket dipped in smallpox, would, by 2022, threaten to tear them apart. Instead, they proceeded, in the first 2 years of his presidency, to send another tax gift to the rich. That just dug themselves into a deeper hole with the voters, counting on their past donation patterns to keep them on top. What does this money look like when you look at individual races? A major thesis is that our congressional members have been turned into slaves. This graph shows the distribution of spending by the 533 candidates that open secrets identified as either incumbent members of Congress who ran for re-election in 2022 or non-incumbents who ran then and won. There's other data, but for this purpose, this data is enough to make my point. The candidates are arranged on this graph by their rank in terms of spending. Candidates who spent the most are sorted to the left side of the graph. One candidate spent almost $180 million. People on the over on the right spent much less. In some cases, almost nothing. 3 main points. First, the top 20% in terms of expense were in competitive races. Second, the bottom 60 to 80% are much less competitive and drastically less expensive. The cost curve flattens out extremely sharply. It quickly drops from an average of 26 million down to less than 5 and mostly less than $2 million. We have a lot of safe seats. Third, the 20% most competitive races have proved capable of motivating small donors to donate. As much as 25% of the money needed for those races came from small donors. Finally, small donor interest drops off quickly as seats become safe. Most safe seat members are beholden to big donors for 90 to 95% of their funds. If there's a primary challenge, there is no base of loyal individual voters ready to step up and help them run a campaign. This, plus the need to help raise funds for the super expensive races, is the basis for congressional slavery. We just showed that the majority of members are in safe seats and only need to spend $2 million or less. A few more up to $4 or $5 million. The rest, the competitive ones, need a lot of money. Much of that money must be raised on the backs of congressional members sitting in their cubicles making phone calls to the wealthy and successful to learn what they want and ask for that money. The trend looks like 2024 will have a $12 billion price tag. Dividing that $12 billion target by the House and Senate races yields $20 to $30 million apiece. That seems unreasonably high. Hard to say, but the individual target might be as much as $10 million apiece. The rest of the money must come from big donors and party outreach to small donors. So, the member is not dialing for dollars to spend on his own campaign. No, he's trying to help gather money for the super expensive competitive ones. So, following on to the previous slide with its huge numbers of less expensive, non-competitive, so-called safe seats, why are the few remaining races so super expensive? They're that expensive because the stakes are super high. As things are now, with the country so divided, by winning a few competitive seats, either party can assume 100% control over certain key aspects of our government. While neither party can effectively govern under these circumstances, each can dramatically change certain key aspects by winning just a few seats, start or close a tax loophole, start or shut down certain expenditures. Without a serious primary contender, in the vast majority of seats, it takes very little money to run the combined primary and general election. The party and candidate might have to spend $1 million or so. While that's a lot more than 30 years ago, it's not too hard to find. On the other hand, that also means, because it's so important to win those few competitive seats, that there's always many donors willing to step in and help fund a campaign. But not just defend against an opponent from the other party. Money is also needed to help with primaries, because it is control of primary spending that keeps Congress locked into its party-focused member slavery gridlock. So, when I say the stakes are extremely high and winning gives control, what are we talking about? Well, we have the Supreme Court. Until the early 1990s, with the selection of Clarence Thomas, there had never been a case where a Supreme Court justice was voted into office by a margin of only 1 or 2 votes. The norm was broad bipartisan support. In the 2000s, it's happened 5 times. In the 2000s, we see the same thing about laws with major budget implications. No Democrats voted for the tax cut laws. No Republicans voted for the Inflation Reduction Act or the Affordable Care Act, with complete gridlock on just about everything else. We've got a Congress that doesn't work anymore. The super expensive races indicate a belief by many that flipping those few seats from one party to the other is critical. Surveys show that in 2000, most voters didn't think it mattered much who won the presidency. By 2020, 73% of the population thought it mattered a great deal. Yes, the stakes seem much higher. To understand how our current system of campaign finance has led to the disaster we have now, we need to understand a couple of things. First, what was the process Congress used when it actually did function? And then we need to understand how the desperate need to raise campaign funds has impacted that process. In other words, what was there before? What changed to turn our congressional members into slaves manning the fundraising oars of a war galley called a political party? Over its 2 centuries of mostly successful operation, especially in the 20th century, Congress operated under a system called regular order. That system started to dissolve in the 1990s as fundraising became king. Under regular order, members represented their district or state and developed laws. Under that system, each member had several tasks. Their first task was to understand what their voters wanted. They were supposed to understand the unique aspects of their districts, while keeping in mind the broader context within which the country was operating, and then vote accordingly, with the expectation that their re-election depended primarily on their ability to match their congressional votes to the voters' wishes. Under this system, the workload of the House and the Senate were divided into committees. Each member was assigned one committee and a few subcommittees. Members were expected to become expert on the topics of that committee and their few subcommittees. In the committee work, their job was to work with the other members of the committee of both parties and with the corresponding committee in the other chamber. Their job was to work out issues and prepare bills. Before fundraising ruined things, back when parties represented right and left halves of the middle of the electorate instead of the extremes, there was usually enough sense of bipartisanship for a committee to get work done. Once a bill was out of committee, the members' next task, as topic experts, was to help the leadership sell these proposed laws to others, especially other members of Congress and the public. Those were their 5 basic tasks. What's their job now? Not those tasks. For a tiny number of competitive seats, the member's primary job is to raise funds for his own re-election while reassuring district voters that he and his party would represent their interests best, but not so the member could vote for his district. Instead, by being re-elected on the backs of massive infusions of cash from donors, he could ensure that his party would dominate during the next 2-year session. For the rest, for the vast majority of safe seats, the member's primary job is to raise funds for the party. In order to make their fundraising more effective, both houses have tripled their members' committee assignments. When dialing for dollars, this allows members to claim they have more influence. When talking to a potential donor, it becomes, "Oh, you're interested in XYZ. Well, I'm on the XYZ committee." Implication? Send me money because I can influence the legislation that comes out of that committee. While sophisticated donors understand that the XYZ committee rarely meets and has no real ability to craft legislation, this ploy can raise money from less sophisticated ones. The innovation that has done the most to increase the focus on fundraising was cutting the members' working time by about 2/3. They did this first by dialing back the schedule. Congress now only meets 3 days a week instead of 5, and is in session for only 30 weeks out of the year. This has had the wonderful effect of giving the members more time to raise money. And second, when Congress is in session, members are compelled by the party to spend half their time out, away from the houses of Congress. That time is spent in little cubicles dialing for dollars, or in cars in the official parking lot. With multiple committee assignments, with meetings scheduled on top of one another because of short sessions, and with little time after making fundraising calls, few members could actually do committee work. On top of that, sort of chicken and egg, after 30 years of growing social division and congressional dysfunction, it is not clear that the members of a committee would be close enough in their positions to ever work together to craft a bill. Hence, leadership can almost never assign bill writing tasks to committees. The work would never get done. That's the fundraising part. The other task members now have is to vote. While the member has no role in crafting legislation, he may have some power by participating in subgroups called caucuses. A caucus may be able to indirectly affect a bill's final leadership written form, since the leadership must negotiate with them like a rancher herding sheep to ensure the party line vote required to support or defeat a bill. So, what's been the result of this congressional slavery? The result is clearly a broken legislature. When members have little useful knowledge of the voters, whom they have no time to meet, or the issues about which they have little time to study, party leadership has little reason to listen to their members. Dependent on the party and big donors to protect themselves from being primaried, the members have little power to vote against their leadership. Without the power to say no, leadership has even less reason to listen to them. Beyond that, with parties and the population bitterly divided, again because only extremes donate, there is no possibility of bipartisan support for most legislation. Enacting a law requires complex tricks to avoid the filibuster, tricks that forego regular order and substantive committee meetings. In that world, on most topics, there is no legislative role for mere members. Thus, most members are basically hired salesmen. They are, in essence, employed by donors to convince voters and other donors to give power to party leaders, not power to themselves, to the leaders. There's a sense of discouragement, of learned helplessness. They've never seen Congress actually work as advertised. Unlike the job they thought they were running to fill, few members have experienced the satisfaction of exercising power to help their voters. There are members who would like to vote in the middle, who would be willing to compromise, but they can't. They are trapped by our campaign finance system. And what about Congress? To the extent that it is running at all, it's being run by the parties in a desperate holding action. As I write this, the two Republican parties are simply making noise, and the Democrats can only play defense. No significant legislation can be passed. Money can be spent, but long-term planning is impossible. In the past 22 years, there have been 8 years when one party held both Congress and the presidency. In those brief times, some key controversial legislation got squeezed out. 2 Republican tax cuts, the Affordable Care Act, infrastructure funding, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Other years, except for emergencies and war, gridlock. While Congress served as a backdrop for the opposition party to stage political theater, which suits those who like the rigged status quo, fiddling while our world is heating up and often literally burning. The whole middle of the electorate is disgusted. The number of voters who call themselves independent is at an all-time high. A middle third party might be conceptually appealing. However, not only are there massive practical barriers to such a thing, but our primitive election laws, relying on poorly attended partisan primaries that only need a plurality to win, make third parties unappealing to voters when they actually reach the booth. It seems like wasting a vote. The last attempt, under Ralph Nader, led to the election of George Bush instead of Al Gore. In a desperate attempt to do something, the Democrats abandoned the filibuster rule for judges. That is, they abandoned the requirement that the judges be supported by a significant majority of the Senate, and ended up with 4 more extremists that are driving the country apart and convincing the country to no longer trust its courts. The filibuster for legislation seems to be hanging on by a thread as exotic steps are taken to spend money by 51-50 votes. Instead of doing things to drive us apart, such as abandoning the good concept behind the filibuster rule, i.e. don't pass laws or appoint judges that can't get wide public and legislative support, why not fix the root of the problem? That problem? Election campaigns financed only by big business and rich people. Many fixes have been proposed. I'll discuss many of them later. But if there's a simple fix, that will inspire the public to act in 2024, why not pursue it instead? This presentation is about repairing our political system to stop the continuing damage caused by our system of campaign finance. Up to this point, I focused on showing the damage and understanding how that pattern is sustained by the current system. I claim a system of public campaign finance vouchers is the only viable way to fix the current system. Beyond that, I claim that certain features of that program are necessary and others should be avoided. In order to understand why a voucher program is necessary and why such a program needs to be configured a certain way, we need to forcefully address some common misunderstandings. Because the public has these misunderstandings, we can be trapped into thinking we should do certain things that we don't need to do and not adopt some critical policies that are desperately needed. Hence, at several stages in this presentation, I'll ask you to redo your thinking about these 6 topics. First, the belief that there's always been money in politics, so this 3-decade-long pattern is nothing new. I've heard about money in politics all my life, so why would anyone think that now is different? Second, a belief that politicians are corrupt. If they're not corrupt, how could they have done all these things to rig the system to benefit the rich and successful? Third, a belief that campaign money is evil and so are big donors. Surely money is the root of all evil, right? Fourth, a belief that my well-meaning donations cannot bias policy. If my donation was designed to bring about good to others, how could it bias policy? Fifth, vast amounts of money are being spent on campaign finance. We were just talking about a bunch of campaigns that will cost $12 billion. That sounds like a lot of money to me. And finally, that the rich can always win an election by just pouring in more money. Isn't politics like everything else in life? The highest bidder wins? We will confront all these beliefs. The program of vouchers I propose will make sense when people understand the truth. To manage our $12 trillion economy, we are running a bunch of elections that will take in campaign finance donations of roughly $12 billion in the 2-year election cycle ending in 2024. Is that a lot of money? Well, compared to what? Compared to my household income, sure, $12 billion is a lot, but that's not a reasonable comparison. Think about it. That $12 billion will be used to install the managers of our country for at least the following 2 years. We need to compare that $12 billion to the economy that is managed by that $12 billion. Basic answer: no, it's not really a lot of money. It turns out it's a lot more than needs to be spent, but compared to the target, it's not a lot. That donation money is, in essence, a finder fee paid to hire managers to lead our country for 2 years. 1 year of U.S. gross national product is about 12 trillion. That's trillion with a T. So, over the 2-year election cycle, the U.S. GNP will be about 24 trillion. Hence, that 12 billion is about 1/20th of 1% of the corresponding 2 years of GNP. Is that a reasonable fee for that service? To suggest an answer, just to put that 1/20th of 1% in perspective, think about what we might pay for a couple of services. First example. How much is the typical family willing to pay to keep itself mildly entertained in the evening? About half of them subscribe to a streaming TV service like Netflix or HBO or Disney+. Such things cost about $100 a year. There are 133 million households in the U.S. If we take that 12 billion Spread it over the 2-year election cycle and divide it by 133 million households, we get about $50 a household per year. So our donors are spending about half as much as the country spends on 1 year of Netflix. And how does that $50 a year compare to the 1/20th of 1% of GNP? Well, the U.S. median household income is about $71,000. That $50 is also about 1/20th of 1% of that $71,000. Second example. Suppose you have some retirement money. So you hire a fee-only financial advisor to manage your retirement assets for you. That person's going to charge you a fee, not a measly 1/20th of 1%. Instead, you are looking at a minimum of 0.5% for your assets. That's 10 times higher. In other words, our country is being managed for a fee of 1/20th of 1%. That's a mere pittance in the larger scheme of things. While it might be far more than we would eventually need to pay with a fully implemented voucher program, it is not an absurdly large amount to pay. Instead of being managed by voters, our country is managed by a minority made up of donors. That spending succeeds in benefiting practically no one, not even most of the donors. The donors are watching helplessly as our country is ripped apart and dissolved by the acid of mutual fear and hatred. Hatred coming from a system that feels rigged, a system that was originally designed to be managed by legislators responding to voters, but currently they are legislators in name only. They are slaves manning donation pumping stations trying desperately to keep their parties afloat. Legislators who cannot afford the time to listen to mere voters. This slide doesn't add anything to my argument except introduce a couple of analogies that may make it easier to get across the idea to others. First, we can lead around a bull by putting a ring in its nose and tying a little rope to that ring. With that arrangement, a huge animal that we otherwise couldn't easily control can be controlled with modest effort by an otherwise weak person. That's essentially what campaign finance has done. It has put into the hands of donors, a small minority of the population, a rope connected to a nose ring to allow them to control our country with modest effort. A second useful analogy, I think, is the story of Jack and the Beanstalk. Jack was set off to sell his mother's cow, but somebody convinced him to sell that cow for a handful of beans. Beans that seemed such a bargain. A bargain because the beans were described as magic. Luckily for him, they were magic. We have essentially sold our government for a handful of beans. For a public that does not donate, giving up control to the donors may also seem like a bargain. Money does not directly leave their wallets to go to the politicians. Unfortunately for them and for the rest of us, unlike Jack, there's nothing magic about those beans. They are certainly no bargain. They have cost us a massive transfer of income and wealth to the rich and successful. Far more costly, they threaten to rob us of the democracy that our founders used a new world to bless us with. As far as I know, the next giant will not fall out of the sky or allow us to fit him with a nose ring. The effect of campaign donation patterns on our government is even worse at the state and local level. Small donors tend to focus on elections for president and Congress. The big donors have gotten smarter. In the era of social media, most advertising dollars have gone to the big social media groups, especially Facebook. This has left very little money for local press. The local press has basically dried up. Even where there are remaining papers or local news sites, Most of them have been bought up by big media corporations for cents on the dollar. Corporations representing the interests of those same big donors, typically a conservative point of view. Without a viable local press representing local interests, no one is looking very hard at local or state government. This puts control within reach of the big donors. Apparently, there is a plan being contemplated. Since each state has one vote in a constitutional convention, if you control enough states, 34 would be enough, they could call a constitutional convention and rig the system permanently. Meanwhile, until that happens, big donors will fight like crazy to preserve the status quo in every state. We showed this list of misunderstandings before. Let's take a look at what the clarifications are. Let's revisit this list of campaign finance misunderstandings. First, there's always been money in politics, so this 3-decade-long pattern is nothing new. I've heard about money in politics all my life, so why would anyone think that now is different? It is different now. With primaries, the cost of running campaigns grew, and when it did, the need for money grew dramatically. The source of that money, now as before, is a very small and unrepresentative part of the population. And money did and still does turn policy towards favoring donors. What is really different is the size of the effect on policy. The effect, now that members of Congress can no longer represent voters, has been massive. Second, politicians are corrupt. If they are not corrupt, how could they have done all these things to rig the system to benefit the rich and successful? No. Politicians are no more or less corrupt now than they've ever been. Unfortunately, they're all prisoners of a very corrupt system, a system that turns them from advocates for their voters into salesmen working for their parties. Third, campaign money is evil, and so are big donors. No, campaign money is needed to inform the public about issues. It takes money to do that. Besides, donors have a right to be heard. They have a right to use the resources for that. The thing is, with primaries, their money became much, much louder than it used to be, and the public, the voters, are still living in the old world, now long gone, thinking they can sit back and count on their representatives continuing to listen when all they do is vote. Votes without money attached are very hard to hear. Fourth, we need to push back on the implicit belief that my well-meaning donations cannot bias policy and hurt others. If my donation was designed to bring about good for others, how could it bias policy? Well, here's the problem. The part of the population that is capable and willing to donate, the successful part of the population, isn't very representative of the rest of us. What seems like good policy to them is not necessarily good policy for the people who are not donors. When you don't walk in their shoes, it's difficult to share the same perspective. Fifth, vast amounts of money are being spent on campaign finance. $12 billion sounds like a lot of money. As we just saw, that's not right. Yes, it sounds like a lot of money to any particular person, but it's less than 1/10 of 1% of GNP, and the average household spent more than that on Netflix or Disney Plus. It's really not that much money. The problem is, it's money that's not being answered by money coming from the rest of the public. Finally, the misunderstanding that the rich can always win an election by just pouring in more money. Isn't politics like everything else in life? The highest bidder wins? No. Up to a point, money helps visibility. If you don't have any money to run a campaign, you certainly are going to lose to somebody who does. But with enough visibility, the election result will depend on factors other than money. Can the rich always win by just pouring in more money? No. They're willing to put money in now because, at least in the past, it often worked. They got the results they wanted. Just review the many policy messes we discussed at the beginning. Once spending more money stops getting the results they want, then there's no point in spending more money. More money isn't going to win an election if the other candidates have enough visibility and their policy positions reflect voter preferences. There are lots and lots of elections where the person who spends the most money doesn't win. We have a simple story. Because of the need to finance primaries, there's been a tremendous increase in the amount of money it takes to run elections. That money mainly comes from the rich and successful, the usual big donors that have always been willing to spend some money to influence government action. But almost none of it comes from the rest of us. Almost none of it comes from the regular voters. As a result, our members of Congress have found it necessary to spend virtually all their time working to gather donations instead of trying to write legislation. We've watched the country become extremely divided and rigged. It's simple to understand. It's all about needing to raise money and not getting nearly enough from the voters. Why are so few politicians and news analysts, but especially the politicians, talking about this? There's a simple reason. Primarily, our political leaders are too embarrassed to talk about it. It's not murder, it's not cheating on your spouse, but it's definitely not a good look. Quote, I wanted to be elected because I thought I could help. Quote, I just didn't have time to listen to those who don't donate. Quote, I didn't like it. Once I was in office, I felt I had no choice. Maybe not confession to a crime, but still hard to say. Yet, saying those words is important. It's vital. A few have said these words after leaving office, but these words need to come from the office holders now, while they're in office. Because when those words are said in office, the next question automatically follows. What do you do about it? Confession is good for much more than the soul. Confession opens the door to action. What are the politicians going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? That's what's needed, but we have to start with the confession. This is the beginning of the third part of this presentation, the do part. What do we do about this problem? In this section, I'm going to talk mainly about a campaign finance voucher program, which I claim is the only solution that is viable and achievable in the time frame we're talking about. That is, get support for it organized for the 2024 election and get the legislation enacted after that election, regardless of which party wins that election. What is that solution? A national program to send campaign donation vouchers to voters. Vouchers so they can donate money to candidates, enough money that voters become heard. It's explicitly allowing private money to be heard, but not allowing such donations to remain what they are now, the unanswered controlling factor that shuts out the wishes of the non-rich public. And without restrictions on private giving, though we do need to address sufficient, though not perfect, visibility on such giving. It's the only solution. I'll explain why we should reject other approaches. It's a viable solution. It'll do the job of returning our country to its normal level of chaos. It's been tried. It's worked where it's been tried. It's achievable. It's achievable legislatively if the public can be convinced to come behind it and call on their now confessing representatives of both parties to act. Representatives that can be made to see a way out of the slavery they live in now. It's achievable administratively, though its size makes it more challenging than the smaller early systems. It's financially achievable, matching what is being spent now. We've already established we're not talking about that much money. It's achievable judicially. It doesn't require some big heavy lift by an uncooperative Supreme Court. If a voucher program is the only way to get out of this mess, then the key issue is, how do we get there legislatively? That requires finding answers to certain key questions. First, is there a way to make this a win-win step for the public and all or almost all of the donor communities? Later in this presentation, I go into some detail about how I think the public and the various donor communities will respond to this proposal. I suggest there that hope is justified. Next question. Can congressional members be brought on board? Will they see this as a way out of slavery? Will they confess to the truth of the current situation? And will they then push their parties to try vouchers? I think most will, if we can get the public to push them close to the edge of what may look like a dangerous leap into the unknown. I say that because I think most of our members got into this business with good intentions. Next, can party leaders be inspired to support vouchers? None of them, the congressional members or the party leaders, have much hope for the future right now. They all recognize the mess we're in. None of them have proposed any kind of viable solution, just more of the same zero-sum thinking and division. Can they see this as a way out? I think they can, but that is an open question. Leadership is required. Leadership by these people who are, by default, our leaders. The steps I lay out in the rest of this final section are designed to encourage them to step forward. Why have they not posed this path already? Nothing in this presentation is completely unknown, but perhaps not very many leaders have seen the problem the way I've described it. I certainly don't think the public has, and frankly, I don't think most analysts have either. Perhaps seeing the problem something like the way I've described it is necessary for the voucher solution to pop to the top. In any case, I think the key to get it there legislatively is to get leadership to conceive of vouchers as a way to break out of the deadlock we're in. So, what is a campaign finance voucher? Sometimes it's called a democracy dollar. Let me just read you a definition. It's an authorization or certificate given by the government to a voter. It's passed by the voter to their chosen candidate. The candidate uses it to get money from the government for campaign expenses. We'll get into the details later, but let me point out that the certificate can be printed or virtual, and the means to get the money may need to be indirect to ensure a proper legal process. In short, voters use some tax money to support candidates that they choose. Put another way, all voters can be donors. Let me sketch out the voucher process. Starting from a list of registered voters, each voter is sent a set of certificates. They could be mailed paper documents or emailed or some suitable hybrid process. What candidates could the voters send these vouchers to? First, they must be qualified to be on the primary or general ballot in the voter's district. Second, the candidate has to be serious by showing that they have already received a minimum amount of money in the form of small donations. How much are these vouchers worth? Well, they need to be high enough to do the job. We want to break the deadlock. A possible target would be to match what was donated privately in the previous election. That requires an estimate of how many voters will use the certificates and how promptly they will use them. Seattle found that it took a little while for people to get used to the idea. The number of vouchers that got used increased from one election to the next. The vouchers themselves are used by the candidates to get money. The safest way to do this would be for candidates to use the vouchers as collateral to get bank loans. The loans would be paid off by the government. After verifying and submitting the documentation submitted by the candidate, the bank would get back the loan money plus interest and administration fees. Independent audits would check this material. If a candidate doesn't follow the rules, then the candidate owes the money to the bank. What are the rules? The money must be used for legitimate campaign expenses. Candidates must be transparent about how they spent the money, and they must submit documentation promptly. We could require candidates who wanted to accept vouchers to adopt restrictions on how much money they could gather from other donors. That may eventually turn out to be a useful constraint. However, I'm feeling very gun-shy about our Supreme Court. Given that we are only talking about $12 billion, if we have sufficient visibility about spending and the amounts from vouchers are large enough to ensure the candidates can be seen and heard, I see no reason to have restrictions on what other money candidates can get. The candidates can pledge to restrict donations from large donors. There could even be two kinds of voucher-eligible candidates: candidates who pledge to restrict themselves and candidates who don't. That should be enough. People who avoid the pledge are going to label themselves negatively in the eyes of the public. That will affect their attractiveness to voucher users and ultimately win voting. I argue that restrictions on outside donations are not needed. The system will work as long as enough money is available in the form of vouchers. Let's talk about the first step to do something about the situation. The first step is to speak the truth. A few slides ago, we discussed how hard it is for our incumbent members to speak about the donor dependency they find themselves in, or how hard it is to get anything done. We need our leaders, our analysts, and everyone else to describe the problem up front and out loud. Describe the problem of a Congress that cannot work for its voters but must spend all its time trying to raise money. The Republicans can say, "We just couldn't get money from voters. Not enough of our loyal voters are small donors. We just couldn't get the money from them. But we need the money to run our campaigns. Without money from regular income voters, life has become a frustrating daily grind of pleading for money from the wealthy." The Democrats need to first grab back what Trump said. Trump said the system is rigged. Yes, the system is rigged. It's rigged at least partially because we also listen to those with more money. We listen to donors. We have the same problem as the Republicans. We couldn't get enough money in the form of small donations from our voters. Now, after Trump, we do get more small donation money from our voters than the Republicans do, but it's still not enough, and it's mostly focused on a few races, not the safe seats. All seats need money, and that money needs to come from the voters. It's important for both parties to acknowledge that we just drifted into this. None of our current members of Congress ever worked in a situation where money wasn't a serious challenge. It's been gradually building for 30 years since the early 1990s. Almost none of the current members of Congress have ever worked where regular order was the way work got done. The situation we see now had really become the norm by the early 2000s. Finally, our leaders need to say that we can fix this, but we still need the money. We've got to find a different way to get the money we need to run campaigns. The way we've been doing it is bad. We need to claw our way back up from the deep hole we are in now. The saying is, you get what you pay for. It costs money to hire a member of Congress. Most of us have been paying nothing, and that is roughly what we've been getting. Nothing, or perhaps much less than nothing. Certainly nothing good. The second step of the three-step process is, like the first, something that needs to be done immediately, well prior to and during the 2024 election campaign. What is this step 2? Our leaders and others with influence must call on the public to donate and watch in total shock as the public responds, using words like the following, quote, "Donate not just to charities to save others. No, donate in a bid to make your wishes become relevant. Donate to help pay the cost of electing the next congressman or senator. Put your purchasing power to work for your vital interests." Quote, "If you like your member, be a redeemer. Release your member from the donors he or she is now enslaved to. Give them the power to work for you. Give them the power to refuse to obey commands from party leaders. Commands that not only tell them to spend all their time dialing for dollars, but also threaten them if they don't vote and speak the party line. Give them the power they need. Quote, if you don't like your current member, send money to organizations or a party that will use that money to help elect someone you will like. When that person is elected, let them know that you'll have their back with money, not just your vote. And if you, like most of the country now, are so disgusted with Congress that you call yourself independent, do the same. There will be some organization that reflects your views. In other words, attach money to your votes or your complaints. Now, how much money? Not much. At least, not much per person. But cumulatively, compared to what the donors are spending now, a lot. Lots of us pay monthly fees to sprinkle some entertainment over our evenings. Our Netflix money. Match that. It'll be more than enough. Perhaps donate a bit less just to start developing the habit, or a bit more to increase the effect. While you are at it, send an email and tell the recipient what you're interested in. They will suddenly have a reason to listen. What will be the effect of this step? It will shock and amaze our members. It will lift the gloom and despair that suffuses Congress now. But not everyone has even a $100 bill to send, and any big campaign will not last forever. That's why we need a publicly funded voucher program, a program that will put true influence in the hands of every voter. That's why, as a major part of the second step, we need to emphasize two other aspects. First, urging voters to ask the Litmus Test question. If elected, will you support a voucher program? Second, urging voters to only vote for candidates and parties who answer yes to that question. But the first of these steps is the most important one, donating. Congress doesn't think you care because at best all you do is vote. You don't donate the money, and the money is what they need. Until you put a little money in, Congress cannot listen. I mentioned the Litmus Test question. Here is my suggested text. If elected, will you support a campaign finance voucher program to ensure that all voters can contribute money to help candidates they like run for office? This question should be asked by voters of every candidate and every party that has a platform. Voters should be urged to condition their vote on yes. The first two steps, speaking the truth and waking up Congress with a lot of small donations, need to be started immediately. They make effective change possible after the 2024 election. The third step, of course, is passing the needed legislation. Legislation that seems utterly out of reach given the current Congress, though I would love to be proved wrong about that. But the preliminaries for Step 3 can be started now, before the next elections. Now is the time for a serious look at drafting the required legislation. I list three types of legislation. The first one is, of course, the voucher program. But the other two are important also, though it will take more time to build a case for them in the public's mind. The vouchers will work best if candidates, including incumbents, have the information they need about public opinions in their own district. Carefully gathered data, as good as that gathered nationally by organizations such as Pew Research, is not available at the district level. Legislation to improve survey support on public opinions, perhaps conducted under the auspices of a trusted organization like the Census Bureau, would pay dividends. As hinted at earlier, we should seriously consider ways to help the public purchase objective news. The echo chambers of social media are using targeted advertising to both amplify division and rob us of community wisdom. We should look at the concept of press vouchers. I'll discuss these a bit later. Let me quickly go through some objections that will be raised to doing vouchers, keeping in mind that Seattle has been running a successful voucher program for a number of years. First, the sticking your head in the sand response. Problem? What problem? What's wrong with what we have? That seems like a silly response, yet I'm sure there are people who are going to make it. Second, It will cost too much. I've already responded to that misunderstanding. We spend as much now as we spend on Netflix. There will, of course, be extra administrative costs to running a program, but the rapid acceleration of spending after Trump's 2016 win suggests that the $12 billion we anticipate for 2024 is mostly an emotional response to our current crisis, with the spending focused on a few critical races. A much lower price tag seems reasonable when all we want is to allow legitimate congressional candidates to have visibility during an election. Third, some will claim that it's an invalid use of tax money. You are forcing me to pay taxes to give money to someone I politically oppose. We've had this kind of program in the United States for presidential elections. Seattle passed a constitutional review. Like any other tax-funded spending, vouchers is simply a way to buy a public good. Though I don't think it's a good idea and don't think it would make any difference, we could have a voluntary checkoff on federal tax returns. Number 4, the administration process would be too complex. While Seattle's program is simpler than what I proposed, they don't seem to be having much problem with it. Fifth, the program would be afflicted by massive fraud. Is fraud possible with a voucher program? Of course. Fraud is always possible. There's no known system where crooks can't figure out a way to shave off little bits. Yeah, fraud is possible, but massive fraud? Fraud large enough to make a real difference? That seems very doubtful when only a few $billions are being spread over hundreds of very public races. And the rules are simple. Every candidate has some skin in the game, and audits are mandatory. Sixth, the rich will simply outspend us. They certainly tried in Seattle, and they got blown away. With enough visibility, the public can see that the spending seems suspicious. The special interest groups win now because their spending is unanswered. They are winning on the cheap. We're giving away our cows for a pittance. When a special interest must deal with facts and reason, they will not win with just money. They will need to line up some winning arguments. Finally, might other approaches be better? Well, maybe, but if there are, then their advocates need to step forward. So far, they haven't. Let me address 5 prominent alternative quote-unquote solutions to correct the distortions caused by our congressional campaign finance practices. First, some people advocate having a constitutional convention, but it's a Pandora's box. All kinds of really tricky things could emerge. Yes, we have a creaky constitution that badly needs to be changed, especially the provision that every state has 2 senators. Nevertheless, a convention seems really risky. In the current environment of hate and disarray, we're not close to being a united country. In this environment, no matter what comes out of a convention, it risks simply driving us further apart. The country stumbled along for a long time with our 2-senator rule. It's being tripped up now because it muffed the need to pay for its elections. Fix that. If that does not do the trick, then look for something else. If we do emerge reunited, a convention might emerge as a good step. Another proposal is to have term limits on our members and possibly Supreme Court justices. If they can't be reelected, supposedly, they will not need to spend time raising funds. But can we be sure of that? Where will candidates get the money to run in the first place? The problem we have is donor control, and the big donors would still be in control of who gets nominated. Instead of dealing with the basic problem, that is, voters not being donors, with term limits, we'd be acting as if our elected leaders have no potential to become experts at their job and please their voters. They used to. What suggests they could not do that again? Another proposal. Restrict dialing for dollars by our members of Congress. If it could be enforced, not a certainty, that might put them back working for us. But they still need the money. Unable to work themselves, they would be even more dependent on the big donors. It would do nothing to put the voters back in control. What about expanding matching for private donations? We have such matching systems now. Who makes those donations? Mainly the rich and successful, not the average voter. So expanding donor matching without a voucher program would work to increase the power of the rich and successful without giving candidates any more incentive to listen to the rest of us. Even with a voucher program in place, expanded matching simply uses that money to make the voices of the rich and successful louder. Finally, the constant theme we hear in certain circles is to somehow find a way to reverse the Citizens United Supreme Court decision and restore restrictions on donations by big donors and corporations. Magical thinking. We simply don't need to do that. Fundamentally, attempts to restrict donations, which is the heart of the Citizens United case, implicitly assumes that the money involved is huge. $12 billion is not huge. $12 billion is a pittance compared to the economy and the population's ability to tax itself to fund vouchers. It's a small bag of money the rich have used to pull our country around by its nose. The bag of money is not huge. With a voucher program, where everyone is a donor, we merely directly outspend the big donors. In its original decision, the Supreme Court said there needed to be laws that make donations sufficiently visible. With both parties completely dependent on donations, including the kind that lacked visibility, and the country so divided, the 2-senator per state rule has made it impossible to pass such laws. Yet, even without those laws, the Open Secrets Organization has made reasonable estimates of the spending. In any case, reversing Citizens United is impossible without winning elections to expand the court. With election wins, that can be avoided by just starting vouchers. And even if advocates of restrictions did massively win elections and did expand the court, that would just make the court more partisan in the eyes of the public and further drive the country apart. I mentioned earlier the need to increase the information available to candidates about what the public really wants. I think a good case can be made for federal funding of surveys to help clarify opinions of the public. It's hard for candidates to know what the public really wants. Surveys are expensive to design and test. They are expensive to execute in a way that maximizes accuracy. We have good ones that are run by private nonprofit organizations like Pew Research, but these tend to be national surveys. They will attempt various breakdowns, but it is difficult or impossible to estimate results at the district level. To help candidates match their policies to voter preferences, or see what needs to be said to persuade voters, data is needed at the district level. In many cases, candidates do pay for surveys, but they tend to sound like and be essentially advertisements. A caricature of this might be the one shown. Which of my opponent's bad policies do you dislike the most? With everyone fearful of internet fraud, when getting clearly partisan surveys or surveys from unfamiliar organizations like Pew Research, the public can be suspicious of the motives of those asking the questions and or the privacy of their answers. As a result, the accuracy is often low with large sampling errors. This could be improved if we had sampling done by the government. Surveys designed, tested, and conducted by, say, the Census Department, using the kinds of personnel and approaches that we associate with the census. There are, of course, difficulties with designing the surveys. Partisans tend to like those biased, "have you stopped beating your wife?" type questions. They also want to address topics that emphasize the issues they want to be visible in upcoming elections. Nevertheless, good quality surveys would be of great help to all candidates. How will groups react to these steps? Responses will depend on their beliefs and prior donation activity. Let me review some groups. Non-donors. Just before the 2022 midterms, a study by LendingTree estimated that 71% of Americans had never made a campaign contribution. That includes both people who usually voted and, of course, those who did not. Since lack of universal donations is the problem, non-donors are the most obvious target. Step 2 is asking them to donate just a little, such as $100 a year or so. Because of their vast numbers, if that 71% respond to Step 2, their money would swamp current donor amounts. Clearly, non-donors have the most to gain under a voucher system. Of those non-donors, those who do not vote have lost the most influence over the past 30 years. Why are they not donating? There's a dominant belief among them that it is hopeless, that their few dollars would not make a difference. This reflects two of the misunderstandings I addressed. That is, people think that the rich and special interests are spending massive amounts of money, which is wrong. And people think that massive additional spending moves votes, that the rich can easily buy an election, also wrong. The non-donating population feels ignored because they are. They have not been told why. They will respond to the truth, especially if they understand how effective their $100 donations can be. That's the non-donors. Current donors must be the immediate target. Politicians are talking with them every day. If donors or the media can be persuaded to push for Step 1, that is, truth-telling about the situation, voucher support could become a plus for politicians and opposition, a negative. That 2022 LendingTree survey showed that of those likely to vote, 29% of Democrats were likely to donate, while Republicans much less at 13% and independents even less at 9%. The Democrats apparently upped their donations in response to Trump. The others hadn't developed the habit yet. Liberal, rich, or middle-income donors probably do not understand that their limited perspective, combined with well-intentioned giving, has helped create the problem. The truth about the system is rigged might take a while to sink in. My liberal neighbors in 2016 could not comprehend that there might be real reasons for people responding positively to Trump. Instead, though they cringed, the word deplorables made some sense to them. But Trump's near miss in 2020 and continued paralysis in Congress highlights the continuing threat. Properly explained, liberal donors will respond. They will see that both their freedom and their economic pie is threatened by the status quo. They will need to accept that asking for a better future could shrink their share of that pie, but a better tasting pie. I think most will. They will grasp that other solutions cannot work. They will support vouchers and continue donating. Some donors, generally liberal and generally higher income, are focused on some topics that have popular support but have been blocked in Congress, such as fighting climate change. These people will support vouchers, feeling that their positions will be enhanced. There are many other issues that get little traction in a Congress that cannot function. Issues such as an ineffective war on drugs that fills our jails. Donors focused on these issues should support vouchers in the hope that oxygen will finally be breathed into our disabled Congress. Conservative middle-income donors fear both dumb liberal ideas and a Trump-like dictator. They see a world red in tooth and claw that operates without kindness and feel they must protect what they have. Polls showing continued, if significantly weakened, support for Trump suggest that they do not yet fully understand the threat they face from the disintegration of society that is represented by Trump populism. Certainly, no one has yet told them how donor denomination has brought on that disintegration. Given the chaos of the last 7 years, they could be persuaded to support vouchers if leaders they respect lay out the case. As noted, recently they had been less willing than Democrats to donate, perhaps feeling protected by donations from big business. They should respond well to Step 2's appeal to donate. Conservative rich donors, who may often overlap with special interest donors, have seen how campaign finance money has paid off handsomely with vast transfers of wealth to themselves via changes to our personal, estate, and corporate tax laws. But they also see the disintegration of society. They know that those who follow Trump-like populist leaders have no love for them and could easily be turned against them. It's not clear that the conservative rich can ever be persuaded to recognize the danger to themselves from the current inequality. They've had plenty of warnings, but like Agamemnon, Cassandras are easily ignored when celebrating success. But it might be worth a try. Special interest donors, mainly business or corporate, have had it almost completely their way for 30 years. They live in a world where quarterly reports and near-term profit are usually the only relevant criterion for success. The temptation to lobby for one more little favor will always be present, along with the use of campaign donations. Without vouchers, those favors are far more likely to be granted. They will be strongly tempted to oppose vouchers, as they have already in several cities that attempted to start a voucher program. Nevertheless, our increasingly ineffective Congress must be a concern. They can easily see the resentment directed their way by popular anger. Rule of law remains the critical foundation of market-driven wealth. Kings and dictators maintain their position by showering financial favors on their close supporters, with rule of law secondary at best. Without a strong legislator, our representative democracy is impossible. Legitimate lobbying with representatives who represent voters rather than donors can restore dignity and respect to lobbying. Business groups can be persuaded that their long-term interests lie in restoration of domestic peace via vouchers, but again, only if there is leadership from a high level. Some donors, generally conservative ones, are focused on less popular single-issue topics such as opposing gun restrictions, restricting abortions, and restricting immigration. These groups seem likely to oppose vouchers, feeling that their relatively unpopular positions will lose the power that their money has given them. There's a large group of Trump small dollar donors. It's hard to predict how they will react. Their opinions regarding money in politics are likely about the same as everyone else's, so their natural opinions about voters should be positive. Nevertheless, given the kind of opposition Republican and special interest voices have usually made against vouchers, they could be swayed to reject them, especially if Trump remains active and adopts his usual pro-special interest stance. Influencers. My impression is that the influencers, the opinion shapers, on traditional media and digital social media are convinced the situation is hopeless. Those in the economically challenged traditional media seem to be heavily invested in the immediate horse race aspects that attract momentary attention. They should find vouchers a hopeful break from the same old same and profitable to support. Social media and streaming services know that keeping users in information-limited echo chambers enhances profits. I don't know if the voucher idea will reach people staring at their cell phones. We will simply need to try. When thinking about how people will react to these steps, we should consider one demographic area where the response may be quite significant. There is a grouping concept that some, such as the Voter Participation Center, are calling the New American Majority, NAM or NAM for short. The NAM group includes three subgroups: minorities, young people under 25, and unmarried women. These three subgroups constitute about 62% of the U.S. adult population. People outside these three subgroups are only 38% of the population. Together, these three subgroups feel especially neglected by Congress. That's because NAMs are much less likely to vote than people who are not in these three subgroups. About 61% of NAMs have been voting. Non-NAMs have a much higher voting percentage of about 75%. That lower voting percentage acts to further decrease the respect and attention from congressional members, reduce it below what one would anticipate from traditional cultural biases. But NAMs are a huge demographic. Because Step 1's truth-telling emphasizes the factual existence versus perception of neglect and shows the simple logical reason for that neglect, donation patterns, there should be an immediate emotional response from people in these subgroups. Because the financial task of the second step's challenge is so modest, $100 a year or so, it should be affordable for a significant percentage of NAM group members. As a result, we should see a relatively large percentage response from these subgroups. Because NAMs constitute such a large demographic, 62% of the population, that could really ramp up the results from steps 1 and 2. Let me review the key points again. Few voters donate to congressional campaigns. As a result, our system has become rigged to favor those who do donate. As a result of that, we've crippled our Congress. We've had a lot of bad laws passed. This has been very bad for the nation. It's divided us, and in the end, it's bad for humanity. We are facing an unresolved climate change. And in fact, the amount of money we're talking about that the donors have been putting up is not that much money. It could be easily financed by people just opening their wallets a little bit. The way we solve the problem is by setting up a system of campaign finance vouchers to make everyone donors and cost a whole lot less. The result will be voters running Congress, not the donors. Where the government works, there's a lot more wisdom and less stupidity. It's better for everyone, even the donors. And what we need to get there is inspiring leadership, and we need it now. And the steps we need to follow are to inspire the public to both donate and to demand the legislation for campaign finance vouchers.